Hello, how are we all? Would like more of that? That kind of... Yeah, it's better. I'm gonna open a window here, give me a sec. Get some more light in. So we're going to start by continuing with Latour, then we're going to jump into some other things. We're starting the stream a little bit earlier going forward. We're going to see how that goes. We'll see if more people end up showing up for that. And, yeah. We're just working on figuring out, like, what the best time is, because as summer comes up, everything slows down. And there's a reason for that. People are going outside. So we don't want to be, like, you know, conflicting with people going outside or so on and so forth. Or if people are going outside, we want to give them the stuff that they can listen to passively, if that's what they want to do. All right. Okay. I don't go outside, I work for a living. A lot of people work outside. All right. So we're continuing from where we left off. Which is the end of nature, I believe. Here we go. Oh, it's jumping around like crazy. How do we fix this? I want this to just slide. How do I do that? No, it's not going to be that. Although that works fine. Although I would love to know how on earth I get it back to not snapping to different pages. Oh, I see what that is. Okay. Oh, ooh. But I'm gonna stick with eye comfort. I actually rather like that. I'm used to it now. Okay. Anywho. Let's get into it. So we're continuing from where we left off last time. We're looking at the end of nature. Again, we are reading Bruno Latour's Politics of Nature, depicted here. And we're just going to jump in. I see Latour talking about non-humans. That is what he do. He is known to do that. And let me just center this quickly before we get into it. Like that. Make it a little smaller so we can fit into the bar. There we go. There, that'll work. Probably bring that in a little bit more even. There we go. That works. Okay. When's the response to Brooks? When I get around to it. Do you think making videos is easy? It takes a frickin' long time. I've got like 3 projects on the go. Soon, don't worry. Probably by next weekend is my current timeline. Okay. All right, ready to roll? Here we go. Okay. The end of nature. We understand now why political ecology has to let go of nature. If nature, quote unquote, is what makes it possible to recapitulate the hierarchy of beings in a single ordered series, political ecology is always manifested in practice by the destruction of the idea of nature. And remember that political ecology is a new attitude towards the relationship between things in the world and between the human collective and other non-human things in the world that doesn't distinguish between different sort of externalized spheres of existence that are metaphysically separate from the human world or from civilization or something like that. Rather, you have a process of integrating the non-human as it is encountered into the discourse of the human collective. And so nature being this external homogeneous thing that is by definition apart from humanity, out of the question. In fact, not just out of the question for political ecology, it is actually a non-politically neutral or a politically non-neutral proposition because it ends up being a fixed part of the world that can then be used as a scaffolding for members of the human collective, whether that's priests, scientists, whoever, who can then use the authority they derive from that fixed external point to short circuit, in Latour's words, political discourse and disagreement by being able to bring to bear unquestionable facts, quote unquote, or divine laws or whatever, or laws of nature to bear against the mere opinion of political activity. And this is a problem for Latour, not because he distrusts scientists, but because this relationship obscures the way in which politics actually produces both the means and the people who are involved in the production of those facts, which are then treated as objects and not as the results of processes of interpretation. A snail can block a dam. The Gulf Stream can turn up missing. A slag heap can become a biological preserve. An earthworm can transform the land in the Amazon region into concrete. Nothing can line up beings any longer by order of importance. When the most frenetic of the ecologists cry out, quaking, "Nature is going to die!" they do not know how right they are. Thank God nature is going to die. Yes, the great Pan is dead. After the death of God and the death of man, nature too had to give up the ghost. It was time. We were about to be unable to engage in politics anymore at all. Readers may protest that this is a paradox. If they do, it is because they have the popularized version of deep ecology in mind. A movement with vague contours that claims to be reforming the politics of humans in the name of the higher equilibria of nature. Now, deep ecology, in my interpretation, is situated as far as possible from political ecology. Moreover, the confusion between these two approaches is what constantly disrupts the strategy of the quote-unquote green movements. And again, just to reiterate at the risk of being redundant, deep ecology is at the farthest remove from political ecology simply because it insists in the strictest terms on not just the fixedness and homogeneity of nature, but on its perfection, permanence, and in fact elevated status with respect to politics. Now, the latter, deep ecology, persuaded that they could, or the green movements rather, the latter persuaded that they could organize themselves along a spectrum ranging from the most radical to the most reformist, have in effect agreed to put deep ecology at the far end of the spectrum. By a parallelism that is not accidental, deep ecology fascinates political ecology as communism fascinated socialism, and as the serpent fascinates its prey. But deep ecology is not an extreme form of political ecology. It is not a form of political ecology at all, since the hierarchy of beings to which it lays claim is entirely composed of these modern, smooth, risk-free, stratified subjects in successive gradations from the cosmos to microbes by way of Mother Earth, human societies, monkeys, and so on. And I believe, and I could be mistaken about this, but I believe actually when he says smooth, and he's going to get into this a little bit farther, I think he's actually taking from Michel Serres. I don't know if Michel Serres originates this, but Michel Serres talks about smooth versus, what is it, like fuzzy subjects, and the difference being in a certain sense that when we think of things as being, as their ontology being constituted by identity, when we have an understanding of the world that is based on the identity of objects within it, we treat their surfaces as if they were smooth, as if there's like a sharp line that distinguishes this thing from this thing. Whereas, in fact, no, things are quote-unquote fuzzy, right? When you imagine, for example, when you try to visualize, rather, the fact that there isn't like a sharp distinction in reality, quote-unquote, outside of our perception, beyond physical objects that we appear to be able to pick up as single individual things, and the area around them, and the universe as a whole in general, you imagine like lines and connections sort of transgressing the visual boundaries of the object, right? Fuzzy as opposed to smooth, is my understanding of this. The producers of this disputed knowledge remain completely invisible, as do the sources of uncertainty. The distinction between these objects and the political world they bombard remains so complete that it seems as though political ecology has no goal but to humiliate politics still further by reducing its power, to the profit of the much greater and much more hidden power of nature, and to the profit of the invisible experts who have decided what nature wanted, what it could do, and what it ought to do. By claiming to free us from anthropocentrism, political ecology thrusts us back into the cave, since it belongs entirely to the classic definition of politics rendered powerless by nature, a conception from which political ecology, at least in its practice, is still beginning to pull us away. Now we can see the problem that obliges us to distinguish between what the ecological militants do and what they say they do. If we define political ecology as something that multiplies matters of concern, his alternative to facts, instead of facts as objects, there are matters raised to be concerned and appraised and integrated by the collective, we give it a different sorting principle from the question of whether it is concerned or not with nature, a question that is going to become not only superfluous but politically dangerous as well. Smooth of Latour is not to be conflated with smooth for Serres or Deleuze. By the way, very different things as I understand them. You want to elaborate on that? Because I am curious. In its practice, political ecology disrupts the ordering of classes of beings by multiplying unforeseen connections and by brutally varying their relative importance. Still, if political ecology, because of the modernist theory that it thinks it cannot get along without, believes that it is obliged to quote-unquote protect nature, it is going to focus on the wrong objective as often as on the right one. Even more perversely, it is going to let itself be intimidated by deep ecology, which, because it defends the largest beings arranged in the most rigid and incontrovertible fashion possible, will always seem to have the high ground, appropriating the power invented by the myth of the cave for its own benefit. For clarification again, the myth of the cave is Latour's appropriation of Plato's image of the situation of philosophers vis-a-vis non-philosophers. So non-philosophers are understood to be essentially people who can be imagined to be trapped underground in a cave looking at a wall with a fire behind them and puppets being put in front of it. And so their entire perception, their entire experience of the world is of shadows, not of actual reality. Whereas philosophers are people who have somehow been freed from those chains. They've gone up out of the cave. They've seen how actual things are and look. They've seen the actual source of visual light, the sun, and so on and so forth. And then they come back down having this superior vision to try and manipulate and or dictate to the people in the cave how they should be thinking. Right? Brooks says, vis-a-vis smooth and fuzzy. Smooth for Deleuze is topological, open, continuous space, which privilege is becoming. Latour uses fuzziness, less smoothness. Smooth is what he is critiquing. Fuzziness is what is produced by degrees of alignment or mediation, not topological. It's more about how ordering happens and is negotiated. I'm gonna have to confess ignorance with respect to Sarah's. I'm basing that off of an intuition, but in terms of this, I feel like it's still topological. I feel like those are both sort of intrinsically topological. I think maybe what you're specifying is Deleuze is talking about literal space as opposed to conceptual space. I could be wrong. But I feel like as soon as you're talking about smooth versus fuzzy, you are actually talking about something that is necessarily to do with an area. There is no such thing as a two-dimensional fuzzy surface, right? That doesn't really... I guess maybe if you're conflating fuzziness with blurriness, maybe. But anyways. Topology is about deforming of space, but the identity of shape is preserved. I thought topology was just any discourse about space. It was just... Oh, it is. Okay. Topology is the branch of mathematics that studies the proportions of space preserved under continuous deformation, such as stretching, twisting, and bending, but without tearing or gluing. Do you mean topographical, then? Unless we're in, like, weird the fold territory, which is possible. Yeah, if you want to call in, sure. Do you want to call in directly, or are you going to join the stage? Oh, there we go. Hello.
How you doing?
I'm doing all right. Hay fever's killing me. How are you?
I'm switching gears like 19 times, and this is another one. Latour's so fun and interesting, and I just want to try to make sense of it. And again, I'm not Mr. Latour. Like, I'll fight for a lot of what I say about Deleuze, and probably even Sayers at this point. But so Latour, I'm less... like 100% confident. So even
I won't fight about Sayers. I was literally just flipping through Parasite, just cursorily, and there's literally a chapter called Fuzzy and the Smooth.
Your intuition isn't wrong per se. Like, this is where it's tough to start like drawing lines between these guys. So if I were to try to say it simply in a way that I just couldn't type, Deleuze fundamentally is fighting for a topological understanding of things because he uses spatiality, because transformation, because folding, because becoming and continuity are ontologically central to what he's building. And Sayers, for example, is doing a fuck ton of the exact same things. In fact, he uses a lot of Deleuzian terms. He's building on that. But his focus is primarily how heterogeneous things come together, how the world and communication coalesces. And that's why you're right in the sense that because that's what Latour's doing. That's like 100% of.
But kind of in the opposite direction, though. Latour is more concerned about from the outside looking at these things, conceiving them as smooth, as opposed to actually fixing on the relations themselves.
So if I had to say like the very specific place where I would be more nervous about saying that he's like looking outside or any of that, the way actor network theory, as I understand it, is about understanding that fundamentally everything is about mediations and translations.
Oh, hold that
wording
thought.
He used. Sure.
Atashkitty4444 super chatted $5. Since Chapter 5 of Deltarune released today, I'm wondering if you'll ever play that or Undertale.
Is that the last chapter of Deltarune? My partner liked Undertale. I haven't played it yet. Maybe, sure, why not? Sorry, as you were saying?
What was I saying? Sorry, I started thinking about Undertale because I need to get that for Dexter.
Well, apparently the new game just came out.
Yeah, I haven't heard. I haven't heard. Like, I don't know about you. I don't trust the Undertale community ever. So I don't know if it's good because no one wants to admit they're part of the Undertale community anymore because it's the worst community in the world. So I haven't like seen a lot of really glowing reviews. So
Did something happen with them? Like, did they get really bad or?
yeah, there's like a nightmare of people to deal with.
Oh, great. The game looks good.
Yeah.
The game looks visually good.
Oh no, I Undertale was excellent. So I get being a fan, but fandoms are shit. So whatever. So Latour, as I understand it, is his function because of how actor network theory is sort of laid out, and his setup is very much not topological, like as a thing. Deleuze Sayers foregrounding that, even if Sayers is going down the realm of communication and understanding. Very different for Latour. Latour is about relations primarily. He's not foregrounding the spatial or topological. It's about traceability. And again, like with Sayers, how does the heterogeneous become commensurable? And that how we order things or how ordering becomes negotiated is how we form hybrids, which is a big deal for him. And so it's not really about smooth or fuzzy or smooth striated. Everything is more or less fuzzy. There really isn't a smooth thing for him. That's like one of his things he goes after is like that idea. He's critiquing the idea that there is just stuff that is homogeneous and simplistic, and instead there's always this really complex mediation that's happening constantly. And that's like
Yeah.
and it's tough because it's like when you talk about like how all these thinkers would talk, Deleuze's smooth space that he famously talked about is the big open space of the desert caravan, right? The desert caravan's the smooth open space where becoming is constant. The planned city is the striated because it's made of grids, property lines. People are where they are.
Yeah.
Latour would look at the same thing and he would just not give a fuck about the comparison. He would be like, okay, so how does this city come to be? Where are the pipes? Where do people walk? Where are the blah, 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 all that shit.
Yeah.
And for him, it's all fuzzy negotiations to produce the order that we understand it as.
Yeah. Okay.
So they're not the same thing. They use a lot of the same language, which is annoying. It's really annoying.
Yeah.
And then like Sayers on top of it, he would do much of the same thing you'd see for Latour. And again, that's why like your intuition's not wrong. It's just what he's doing is instead of dealing with like Latour caring about all of the different potential actors and how negotiations happen, it would be purely about the flows of trade, water, rumors, communication, political action, whatever it is.
Gotcha.
And that would be Sayers' interest through Deleuze. Latour, less through Deleuze, more building his own project, kind of in the sense. So it's like, Jesus Christ. So it's like, you're close. You're not wrong. Like the intuition's spot on. And it's an interesting thing that I think I've seen some people play against each other. And so like, I'm not saying not to go down that road. It's just that they are doing just different enough things.
Well, I haven't read enough Sayers yet, so I'm not going to anyways, but
you will, and you will love it.
Well, I'm liking this.
If you love Latour, you're going to love Sayers.
The Natural Contract was really good. I've ordered Genesis. So I'm going to be going through those three basically over the next month. But
dude, Parasite and Genesis are. I need to get my book. I have my fucking next How to Philosophy is on Genesis. I've been writing it for like, what is it, 7 months now? Jesus Christ, I need to get that out. God, Genesis is so good, dude.
Brooks just discovered the Bible. For those who have just dropped in, he's very excited about it. New Q. It's the Quarantine Christian Collective now. Okay.
Sarah's work is phenomenal, and I won't go off on too much of a tangent here, but what Latour's doing here is, and again, and I would love your thoughts on this, and I'll disconnect. I'll long-time listener, first-time caller kind of thing. As I understand Latour, he is primarily focused on those negotiations, those mediations. This is his jam. It's why he has written the books he has. It's why he's done the things he's done. He's really focused on like the idea of the becoming from the parts, and that the parts negotiate to create, and that everything is naturally fuzzy that way. It's again simplistic, oversimplified version of it. But
Jelma
that
says,
seems to be what he's doing here too.
Jelma says someone who taught us both adored Sayers, in particular the Five Senses, at least back in 2010. Is this the one who had a stroke, or is this the martial artist one? I'm actually probably going to guess. I'm guessing the one who had a stroke, but I could be wrong. Anywho.
Sarah's
She survived the stroke, by the way.
The Statue trilogy is phenomenal, but Parasite and Genesis fundamentally made me rethink how, like, these are formative books, so I'm very excited for you to get through them.
I am also Parasite. It wasn't print on demand. It was actually.
That would almost be like a thing of art if it was print on demand in its own way. Like,
my copy of the Natural Contract was. That was print on demand. As soon as I got it in, I saw that split in the middle. Then lo and behold, back page, manufactured by Amazon.
Interesting.
Every single one, I don't know what it is. I'd love to see their actual printing machine, because it always produces them with this split in the text, regardless of the size. Exactly one split right in the middle. And I guess what happens is when it's being bound, it must have the pages just like lying flat somehow before it glues them. But I don't get it. Or there's like a thicker glue in the middle for some reason. I don't understand it. But I think that might be what it is, because there's a little bit of the glue in the middle there. You can see kind of between the signatures, it goes down a little bit. It's kind of hard to see with this light, but anyways.
It's going to be this section that you're reading right now. I'm going to be curious how you kind of come to describe a thing that happens in a couple paragraphs. So it'll be interesting to watch. I'll be annoying and yelling at you from the stand, as always. Enjoy yourself.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Neither of those. Tinted his fingers a lot, resembled a praying mantis, a man who taught us? Who resembled a praying... Oh. I know who you're talking about. And he talks like this. Anyways. I was thinking it was somebody in philosophy. Anywho. Is he still living? Oh my god. I actually don't know if he's still alive. I haven't heard from him in years. Anywho. Where were we? Yes. As soon as the situation shows arrangements that are different from the ones it had predicted, that is always, political ecology is going to think it is mistaken, since in its respect for nature, it thought it had at last found the right way to classify the respective importance of all the beings it purported to be linking together. Now it is precisely in its failures, when it deploys matters of concern with unanticipated forms that make the use of any notion of nature radically impossible, that political ecology is finally doing its own job, finally innovating politically, finally bringing us out of modernism, finally preventing the proliferation of smooth, risk-free matters of fact, with their improbable cortege of incontestable knowledge, invisible scientists, predictable impacts, calculated risks, and unanticipated consequences. And I am going to clean my glasses because I just realized I am constantly seeing a fleck on them as a comma, which is why I'm spacing my words weirdly. Which is really dumb. I think he's living his best life somewhere in South America. That's what I heard, but who even knows what that means or if he's alive anymore. We see the confusion into which we are plunged if we mistake political ecology's theory for practice. The opponents of deep or superficial ecology reproach it most often with conflating humans with nature, and thus forgetting that humanity is defined precisely by its removal from the constraints of nature, from what is given, from simple causality, from pure immediacy, from the pre-reflexive. They basically accuse ecology of reducing humans to objects, and thus seeking to make us walk on all fours, as Voltaire said ironically about Rousseau. It is because we are free subjects forever irreducible to the constraints of nature, they say, that we deserve to be called human beings. Now, what best fulfills this condition of removal from nature? Why, political ecology, of course, since it finally brings the public debate out of its age-old association with nature. Political ecology alone is finally bringing the intrinsically political quality of the natural order, I'm putting quotes, into the foreground. We understand without difficulty that political ecology can no longer be presented as a new concern that arose in Western consciousness around the middle of the 20th century, as if since the 1950s or 60s or 70s it hardly matters. Politicians have finally become aware that the question of natural resources had to be included on the list of their usual preoccupations. Never since the Greeks' earliest discussions on the excellence of public life have people spoken about politics without speaking of nature. Or rather, never has anyone appealed to nature except to teach a political lesson. Not a single line has been written, at least in the Western tradition, in which the terms nature, natural order, natural law, natural right, inflexible causality, or imprescriptible laws have not been followed. Oh, here we go. A few lines, paragraphs, or pages later, have not been followed, a few lines, paragraphs, or pages later, by an affirmation concerning the way to reform public life. Certainly, the direction of the lesson can be reversed. The natural order is sometimes used to critique the social order, and the human sometimes used to critique the natural. People can even seek to put an end to the link between the two. But no one can claim under any circumstances to be dealing with two distinct preoccupations that had always evolved in parallel until they finally crossed paths 30 or 40 years ago. Conceptions of politics and conceptions of nature have always formed a pair, as firmly united as the two seats on a seesaw where one goes down when the other goes up, and vice versa. There has never been any other politics than the politics of nature, and there has never been any other nature than the nature of politics. Epistemology and politics, as we now understand very well, are one and the same thing, conjoined in bracketed political epistemology to make both the practice of the sciences and the very object of public life incomprehensible. Bracketed because it's obscured. It's epistemology, the sciences, etc., obscure their political origins and the political nature of what they do, what they scaffold, what scaffolds them, etc. Which is, again, just to reiterate, not discrediting science. It is discrediting capital S science because there is no such thing except as the social mirror of nature itself, right? This idea that there is this grand institution like a priesthood that alone has access to the inexorable laws of nature, right? Sort of like there's that line from Network. The world is a college of corporations. What is it? Completely following the ineffable bylaws of business, or something like that. It's that sort of thing where it's like there are particular classes of humans and human institutions that are just better than the other ones, that are just able to then sort of assert their rights over every other thing, ignoring the fact that it all comprises the same thing. The text is slightly off screen. God damn it. It's an irregular PDF, that's why it bumps from side to side. Let's sort this out. One moment. We'll make it a bit smaller. It'll be fine. Okay. We understand without difficulty. Okay, we read that one. We're down here. Certainly, the direction of the lesson can be reversed. The natural order is sometimes used to critique the social order, and the human sometimes used to critique the natural. People can even seek to put an end to the link between the two, but no one can claim under any circumstances to be dealing with two distinct preoccupations that had always evolved in parallel as they finally crossed paths 30 or 40 years ago. Here we go. Conceptions of politics and conceptions of nature have always formed a pair, as firmly united as the two seats on a seesaw. Okay, we read this. We read all this. We're good. Okay, thanks to these double findings of science studies and of practical ecology, we are going to be able to define the key notion of collective, whose meaning we are thus gradually specifying. In fact, the importance of the term nature, quote-unquote, does not stem from the particular character of the beings that it is supposed to have assembled and that are thought to belong to a particular domain of reality. The whole power of this term comes from the fact that it is always used in the singular, as nature in general. And see, there it is again. Now it's like bumped in the other direction. Why is it like this? Why? When one appeals to the notion of nature, the assemblage that it authorizes counts for infinitely more than the ontological quality of naturalness, whose origin it would guarantee. With nature, two birds are killed with one stone. A being is classified by its belonging to a certain domain of reality, and it is classified in a unified hierarchy extending from the largest being to the smallest. The test is easy to administer. Replace the singular with the plural everywhere. Suddenly we have natures, and it is impossible to make natures play any political role whatsoever. Why? Because they are plural and therefore not fixed and singular with respect to one another. They don't act as like a wall in that way. Natural rights, in the plural, it would be difficult to dictate positive laws by relying on such a multiplicity. How could we inflame minds for the classic debate over the respective roles of genetics and the environment if we set out to compare the influence of natures and cultures? How could we curb the enthusiasm of an industry if we said that it must protect natures? And you can think here in terms of how the notion of international law frequently falls apart simply because law requires some top-down authority that is actually able to enforce the law, when in fact we know that international law is actually never actually enforced as a law. It is enforced or failed to be enforced based upon which parties decide arbitrarily, collectively, to not enforce them or to enforce them, which means they're not really laws. They're sort of they're sort of a codified set of excuses, sanitizing breaches of national sovereignty and the norm of national sovereignty, sort of taking away the sting of it, making it seem like less of a violation. It's a rubber stamp on crossing borders while somehow maintaining the idea that states are sovereign. If you have multiple natural rights, natural laws, etc., they can compete with each other in the same way that the domestic laws of this state and this state can compete, and no one is authoritative over the other one. It doesn't have that same constituting power between states as it does inside of states. By the way, I really don't agree with Latour. Eduardo Veiros de Castro is who he's attacking, by the way, here. Where is he? How is he attacking Castro? What is he attacking by Castro? Whatever it is, it's in French. Whoa, it's in the footnotes. Let's see here. $33. Okay, here we go. How could we use the force of science for leverage if we were talking about sciences of natures, if we said that laws of natures must curb the pride of human laws? No, the plural is decidedly unsuited to the political notion of nature. One multiplicity plus another multiplicity always make a multiplicity. Starting with the myth of the cave, it has been the unity of nature that produces its entire political benefit, since only this assembling, this ordering, can serve as a direct rival to the other form of assembling, composing, unifying, the entirely traditional form that has always been called politics in the singular. The debate over nature and politics is like the great debate that opposed the Pope and the Emperor throughout the entire Middle Ages, when two loyalties, or two totalities of equal legitimacy, divided Christian consciences into two camps. If the term multiculturalism can be used with reckless abandon, the term multinaturalism appears and will continue to appear for some time, shocking or devoid of meaning. And then there is a footnote. The expression was used for the first time, I'm assuming multinaturalism, as far as I know, by Eduardo Viveiros de Castro in relation to the Amazonian conception of the body. Let us note, however, that one of the French journals in the field puts the three terms natures, sciences, and societies in the plural, so the French are not hopeless after all. Is that an attack? I don't know if that sounds like an attack to me. I could be missing some nuance here. It sounds like he's just saying that Castro originated that term. Castro is explicitly multinaturalist, built specifically to show there are many natures. But I think he concurs with this. I think he's affirming that there are many natures. He's insisting he's in agreement with Castro here. I don't think he's He's saying multinaturalism has no meaning. No, I don't think he's saying that. I think he's saying multinaturalism has no meaning with respect to this other rhetorical tool of multiculturalism, right? Because with multiculturalism, what you have essentially is a relegation of culture to the realm of mere opinion, costume, and food, and so on and so forth, like trivial things. They don't have the ability to, for example, like actually inflect the decision of the collective as a state. So politically, like from a Schmittian lens, politically, it has no meaning, in the sense of it has no weight, right? But it's not that it has no meaning for Latour. I think Latour is actually insisting on there being a multinaturalism. I think I disagree with you on that read. I think he's actually agreeing with Castro. I could be mistaken. I'm not reading him that way, though. Right? So he says here, if the term multiculturalism can be used with reckless abandon, the term multinaturalism appears and will continue to appear for quite some time, shocking or devoid of meaning. That appearing is kind of important here. I don't think he's criticizing. Multiplicities cannot become a unity, right? I think a multiplicity is a kind of unity. It's just the point, though, is that one multiplicity plus another multiplicity remains a multiplicity, right? Like, you're talking about a multiplicity, you are talking about the multiple in the one. You're referring to the multiplicity in the singular, right? Or the multiplicities is an assemblage of multiplicities, potentially. What is the effect of political ecology on this traditional debate? The very expression makes the point clearly enough. Instead of two distinct arenas in which one would try to totalize the hierarchy of beings, and would then have to try to choose among them without ever being able to succeed, political ecology proposes to convoke a single collective, whose role is precisely to debate the said hierarchy and to arrive at an acceptable solution. Political ecology proposes to move the role of unifier of the respective ranks of all beings out of the dual arena of nature and politics and into the single arena of the collective. That is at least what it does in practice. When it jointly forbids both the natural order and the social order to categorize in a definitive and separate way what counts and what does not, what is connected and what must remain detached, what is inside and what is outside. Multiplication of objects that put the classic constitutional order in crisis, such is the means that political ecology has found with all the astuteness of a burgeoning practice to simultaneously confuse the political tradition and what has to be called the natural tradition, natural politique. The philosophy of ecology, however, takes great pains not to do in theory what it does in practice, what I propose to say that it does. Even when it challenges nature, it never calls the unity of nature into question. The reason for the gap ought to be clear now, even though we shall need the entire length of this book for it to bear fruit. As long as political epistemology is taken seriously, that is, as long as the practice of the sciences and the practice of politics are not treated with equal interest, nature appears precisely not as a power of assembling equal or superior to that of politics, at least not yet. But then, how does it appear? How can it justify the use of the singular nature in general? Why does it not present itself as multiplicity? Why does it put off measuring itself against politics, and thus letting us see quite clearly that we are dealing with two powers that can be criticized in a single thrust? Because of a fabulous invention that political ecology has already dismantled in practice but cannot dismantle in theory without a slow and painful supplementary effort. Because of the distinction between facts and values that we shall have to sort out in Chapter 3, one could readily grant that there indeed exists a strong unifying power in nature, but this power concerns only facts. Everyone also agrees, of course, there is also a power of assembling, ranking, and ordering in politics as well, but this power concerns values, and values alone. The two orders are not only different, they are incommensurable. Will we be reminded that that is just what the Pope's supporters and the emperors claimed in the Middle Ages? Yes, but we see them now as two commensurable powers, simply enemies, because we have converted them both into secular figures. This is precisely my hypothesis. We have not yet secularized the two conjoined powers of nature and politics. Thus they continue to be seen as two completely unrelated sets, the first of which does not even warrant the name of power. We are still living under the influence of the myth of the cave. We are still expecting our salvation to come from a double assembly, only one of whose houses is called politics, while the other one simply and modestly declares its determination to define matters of facts. We have no inkling that this hope of salvation is precisely what threatens our public life. Just as the fall of heavens, according to Caesar, threatened my ancestors the Gauls, he's French, such is the trap laid by political, brackets, epistemology, the trap that has up to now prevented the various ecological movements from supplying themselves with a made-to-order political philosophy. I do not hope to convince the reader of this crucial point right away. It may well be the most difficult one in our common apprenticeship. It will take all of Chapter 2 to restore coherence to the notion of a collective of humans and non-humans, all of Chapter 3 to rid ourselves of the opposition between facts and values, and then all of Chapter 4 to redifferentiate the collective using procedures taken either from scientific assemblies or from political assemblies. But readers may be ready to acknowledge, even now, that political ecology can no longer be fairly described as what caused concerns about nature to break into political consciousness. This would be an error of perspective with incalculable consequences, for it would reverse the direction of history and would leave nature, a body invented to render politics impotent, at the very heart of the movement that is proposing to digest it. That language is very important. He conceives of the collective as essentially a process of digesting the non-human and making it a part of the body of the collective in that way. The collective being understood as not just the people that make up a political community, but also all of the propositions, all of the things that can be taken to, in a metaphorical or a not so metaphorical sense, to have concerns and interests and, well, we'll stick with concerns. They're matters of concern. Things that want to appeal as matters of concern to the collective to be taken into account in the final reckoning. And there is no actual final reckoning. There's always just new convocations of the assembly and a constant reiteration of the collective with every single decision, with every single crisis, and so on. But he lists some of these later on, so you get sort of a clear sense of what he's referring to. So, like, it can be anything from a river that is drying up. It can be a person who's not being adequately recompensed for their labor. It can be a disease. It can be a supernova, whatever. Stuff like that. The point is, all of these things end up coming into our sphere of concern. They become matters of concern that therefore, in a sense, speak in the collective, just as if somebody was standing up and saying, we got to deal with that fire over there, something like that. Okay. So, nature was invented to render politics impotent. You no longer have to engage in politics in debate and persuasion. Now you can simply refer to nature. This is what happens in nature, so it shall go for us, right? And this is ubiquitous. You'll find it in Aristotle and Plato. You'll find it in Hobbes. Hobbes is a big one. We talk about Hobbes all the time. Hobbes refers to the state of nature as that cruel underlying reality that politics has to address, that states address, that systems of oppression address to save us from. And so it ends up being a very powerful reactionary tool, even if it is revolutionary in its own way. The state of nature ends up being a way in which the range of political possibilities is cut short because of this particular fixed notion of how we are insofar as we are a part of the natural world, as in we are intrinsically violent towards one another, and without artificial state oppression, we'll tear each other limb from limb. So it would be an error of perspective with incalculable consequences, for it would reverse the direction of history and would leave nature, a body invented to render politics impotent, at the very heart of the movement that is proposing to digest it. Were we to say that concerns about nature broke into political consciousness by means of political ecology, it seems much more fruitful to consider the recent emergence of political ecology as what has put an end, on the contrary, to the domination of the ancient infernal pairing of nature and politics, in order to substitute for it, through countless innovations, many of which remain to be introduced, the public life of a single collective. In any event, to say that political ecology is finally removing us from nature or that it attests to the end of nature should no longer be taken as a provocation. The expression may be subject to criticism because it may not do justice to the strange practice of ecologists, but it no longer has, or at least so I hope, the futile aspect of a paradox. When it seems to have that aspect, we were simply at the crossroads between two immense movements whose contrary influence has for some time made the interpretation of ecology difficult, the emergence of nature as a new concern in politics and the disappearance of nature as a mode of political organization. And we're going to wrap it up here for Latour. All right. I'm going to grab some more coffee. We're going to continue with the regular content. I'll be right back. Oh, and reminder, there are two values at the bottom of the screen. There's the theory value and the drama value over there. I need to figure out a way to put my hand on this side of the screen. If you would like us to continue doing theory or to do an additional theory topic, put the word theory into your super chat. If we get to $100 for theory, we skip to a theory topic for at minimum an hour. If, however, you would like the regular content to continue, please put the word drama into your super chat. If we get to $100 in drama, the theory value goes down by 50%. If you would like to, anyone who donates $100 in one super chat gets to pick the next segment, carte blanche, whatever it is. The only rule is I keep my clothes on, okay? I'll be right back, and we're gonna press into some actually related stuff to what we were just talking about. We have choices. Do we want book slop? Is what I'm calling it. Or do we want more politics of nature adjacent stuff? We've got some options here. There's a Gutsick Gibbon video. I like Gutsick Gibbon. Called Darwiniana, How Science and Religion Killed Creationism. And I'm kind of fascinated by that title. There is also, Was Epstein Actually Evil? The Moral Argument for God's Existence, which I think will be fantastically dumb. Alternatively, there's a bad House of Leaves take I really want to watch and go over. It's a really bad House of Leaves take. Really bad. Yes, the creationism? Alright, we'll do that one first, until we get tired. Hold on to your butts, here we go. Let's pull this up. We're not going to go over the whole thing, this thing is 4 hours long. I will die. No, that's the wrong button. There we go, okay. How Science and Religion Killed Creationism. Now, I have some disagreements with the title right off the bat. Because they didn't kill creationism. Creationism still exists, and it thrives. Creationism is not a proposition. Creationism is a movement. It's a set of people with similar, largely political commitments. It's not really a proposition that anyone actually takes that seriously, genuinely. Including, by the way, those elements of people who would identify as being a part of science or a part of religion who quote-unquote killed it. It's not taken as an honest position. And that is correct. Why are we attacking Gutsick Gibbon? I'm not attacking Gutsick Gibbon. I just expect I'm going to disagree with some framing in some interesting ways. I enjoy Gutsick Gibbon. Gutsick Gibbon is one of those few YouTubers I enjoy watching. Not as much as Angela Collier, but, you know, that's setting the bar very high. I heard Latour spoke at a creationist conference in Alabama once. Apparently he really regretted it later. Really? That's interesting. I'm not seeing this online, so I don't know. But anywho, hold on to your butts.
During the 13th century, the Western world had a lot of questions about angels. Medieval society was deeply religious, with Christianity permeating the entirety of culture, from politics and law to entertainment and science. The bulk of the Dark Ages had passed, and people now had the security they needed to ask questions about the world around them.
Okay, I really hope she's going to undermine this, because this is an incredibly false understanding of history that revolves around the mystification of periodization. There were no Dark Ages. That's not a thing. That didn't exist. That didn't happen. There were no Dark Ages. Sorry.
A world which was both divinely conceived and maintained, with the Bible as a foundational text for understanding everything from the nature of man to the natural world. Scholars like St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure asked, what about angels? These mysterious and very real entities were found all across the holy text, and they ranged from familiar to incomprehensible. Did they have physical bodies? Were they limited by time? Did they possess the will and emotions of men? These were real questions about the nature of divine beings, asked in earnest using Aristotelian principles. Now, to be clear, there weren't really any scientists at this time. There were churchmen who moonlighted as scientists.
What does that mean? Genuinely, what does that mean? There were no scientists. There were churchmen who moonlighted as scientists. She must mean scientists by vocation. There were no people who were professionally scientists who were paid to be scientists. I mean, that's not true. There were, actually. There were mathematicians, for example, although they were on the Islamic side of things.
Science worked in service to religion as a means by which to understand God through his creation. And
Okay. Gutsick, I like you. The anthropology here is doing psychological violence to me.
So the learned men asked, how many angels can dance on the surface of a pin? My gentle and, of course, very modern apes, today I'd like to tell you a story. It's a story that's been told before, but I don't think it's been told in this particular way, and
Galileo was church first. Galileo was 16th century.
certainly, at least with this medium, not with this particular focus. So when I was getting my bachelor's degree, my least favorite part of every science class was that introductory bit, the first lecture or so, where you have to learn about the history of whatever science it is that you're talking about. You probably remember this yourself from high school biology or like early university biology or related science classes, where you have to learn about which crusty old person discovered which thing or process. Why, yes, you do need to know the difference between what Hooke did versus what Van Leeuwenhoek did. It is going to be on the exam. I'll give you a hint. They're both into microscopy. To me, the history of how we learned the science that seems so obvious today was just so boring. Teach me about what makes a monotreme, or what the Golgi apparatus does. It's like the post office of the cell. But one of the cool things about getting older is that the things that used to bore you sometimes become just a little bit more interesting. Ask any millennial about birdwatching, they're all over it. And once you get the opportunity to learn just a little bit more
Are we about bird watching?
about a subject that maybe you previously had no interest in, sometimes the floodgates will open and you'll realize how fascinating and shocking and relevant that subject has always been. So my name is Erica, this is my channel, Gutsit Gibbon, and what I normally do here is I keep you up to date on the latest discoveries surrounding my...
Please don't be a nebula plug. Please don't be a nebula plug. It's a nebula plug, isn't it? Okay.
that humans are apes which descend from other apes in the ancient age of the earth, and as I said, all of conventional science, and for that reason, we love them very much, and they are welcome here.
Talented, brilliant, incredible, amazing, show-stopping.
Now, other creationists have been trying for decades to get creationism taught alongside conventional science in schools. Many of them feel as though society has it out for them, not just creationism, but their faith in general.
Because it does. That's true. That's not intrinsically a bad thing, but that's true. That absolutely is true. There is absolutely a concerted social effort to keep that stuff from being given any respect or credence in public schools. That is absolutely true.
They feel that the theistic evolutionists are compromising their faith to fit in, forcing the Word of God to acquiesce to modern science by twisting the text itself, taking Genesis allegorically, for example.
For those who claim to believe in the truth of the Bible, they should understand that in accepting the secular time frame and denying the truth of a global flood, there are far-reaching spiritual consequences to consider.
And historically, many of them also feel that modern science, specifically the idea that Earth is 4.5 billion years old and that humans and all other living organisms result from the slow process of evolution across hundreds of millions of years, was specifically drummed up to oppose them and to pull people away from the faith.
Where did the idea of millions of years in our present world, where did it really come from? Well, we have to go back to the late 18th century, early 19th century, when there were atheists, deists, who rejected God's word, but they were trying to come up with how long it took for the fossil layers to be laid down. Where'd the fossil layers come from? So they wanted to explain it all within naturalism. Well, naturalism is atheism. Naturalism means everything happens by natural processes, everything is material. So how do you explain the fossil record without the supernatural? You reject God, you reject his word, you reject the flood of Noah's day.
First of all, methodological naturalism in science is not atheistic, but we'll get to that in a moment. Suffice it to say, many modern creationists think that conventional science like evolutionary theory is, and always has been, focused on drawing people away from religion and from Christianity. This idea is as true as creationism is, which is to say, it is demonstrably false. I'd like to tell you the story, the epic, of how science and religion killed creationism. Seemingly unlikely bedfellows in our current culture, no? But for the vast...
I don't know what killed creationism means in this context. Creationism exists. There are a lot of them. They teach their kids. They teach their kids. There's a lot of them.
majority of Western history, science went part and parcel with religion. They complemented one another.
I thought the flood story was supposed to be an allegory. It is a mistake. So here's the thing. There are people who insist on... I hate this language of biblical literalism versus sort of an allegorical read for a couple of reasons. There are people who insist on taking the statements of the Bible as true. There are other people who insist on taking the statements of the Bible as true, but in a less committal way. So they take them as true, provided that they are interpreted through some sort of metaphorical lens that makes them plausible with what we know about the world. This is a distinction that an ancient writer would not have entertained. The ancient writer wrote literally. They meant flood when they wrote flood. They meant flat when they wrote flat. They meant round when they wrote round. So, the upshot is that both of these people are wrong, and bizarrely, while more sophisticated and more receptive to modern scientific discoveries, the person who has the allegorical reading of the Bible is significantly less correct than the person who has the quote-unquote literal read, where they take it as a blunt statement, simply because one of them is reading it as an ancient would have wrote it. One of them is reading it to conform to other things in their own ambience to make it make sense. And actually, it's the latter one. It's the one who's insisting on the allegorical nature of the text that's actually making the really bold move that there is a metaphysical truth in this written text that surpasses the limited understanding of the writers at a given time and place. They are actually asserting something a little bit more wild when you think about it. The creationist who takes the flood, for example, as literally true as given, is simply asserting a dumb thing. The theist who asserts that story is true but allegorical, metaphorical, whatever you want, is asserting something less dumb, significantly more wrong. Right? What on earth is going on up there? One moment. My partner was getting out the remaining parts of the desk behind me. All right, here we go.
In the eyes of naturalists and the public alike. Now, to be fair, the birth of many pseudosciences, from flat earth to creationism, came from an inappropriate relationship between science and religion. However, the deconstruction of those same ideas often came from the same marriage, albeit a more egalitarian one. For the most part, it was religious naturalists that killed creationism, at least this go around. This video is about the early history of scientific discovery and how the conflict between religion and science eventually found harmony and took creationism out in the process. As a doctoral candidate myself, I'm fascinated by how science is received by the public and the sordid story of its interaction with creationism through the centuries. Our research question here is pretty obvious. How and why did the original flavors of creationism emerge? And how were these concepts toppled by science, particularly at the hands of religious scientists? When this tale is through, you'll understand how we discovered the Earth is very ancient, how we discovered that evolution is responsible for all modern biodiversity, including our own species, and how modern creationism is, in many ways, the same creationism of centuries ago. You'll probably also understand how it differs, although I won't point that out just yet. This is a true story, although it's one that I think creationists through the decades and the centuries have done a great job hiding from you, which is why I'm gonna tell it. A lot of people have made a lot of money trying to convince the general public that science and religion are necessarily enemies. The sources for
Okay. Here's a take from someone who has not paid a lot of money to convince you that science and religion are necessarily enemies. One of the problems with these categories, we've talked when we're talking about Latour and the politics of nature and capital S science, as like some sort of fixed part of our world. There is the institution and activity of science that makes up this capital S science, the science of I fucking love science, this non-specified, objectless thing that is some sort of conduit into understanding nature beyond mere human opinion and perception. Right? We've talked about the problems with that. Let's talk about the problem with religion for a little bit. I've talked about that too. When we talk about religion as a category, and this is going to be sort of a preliminary response actually to Brooks's critique of my video response to Andrewism, so untangle that, viewers. When we use the category religion, we are talking about several different things at once. And what those several different things are will vary depending on who you're talking about, time, place, etc. Leave that aside. Here's the main point. The actual human investments that determine human behavior, human striving, the confusion of drives that results in other behaviors that we can't really label with those terms, right? When we talk about ultimate concerns, when we talk about institutions of discipline, morality, and so on and so forth, we are talking about a whole bunch of really real things, or further, agglomerations of really real things. People actually are invested in a very serious way in images of certain types of powerful beings or father figures in the sky, or the notion of the continuity of the self after death and things of that sort. They are really attached for deep emotional reasons to the rituals and systems of discipline that form communities and keep people intelligible and familiar to each other, right? That make domains safe and comfortable and understandable. And that fix enemies on the outside, bad things on the outside, around which you can orient yourself. Give yourself some kind of grounding, especially when things get really bad. There is, at the very least, if there's nothing behind you, there's something ahead of you to fight off. This is one of the reasons why Christians in modernity are obsessed with fighting culture wars, because it means they can ignore the fact that all of the critical beliefs that made them able to live with themselves have been effectively discredited. And they can't give them attention lest they realize that their position is empty. So they look at the enemy over there. Trans ideology, cultural Marxism, whatever. Atheism. And they focus on that to distract themselves from the ruin back there. All of this stuff is really real. However, when we talk about religion as a category, we group all of these things together under the sign of this one thing. This one thing called religion, which now encompasses ideas about God, ideas about morality, ideas about the immortality of the soul, the existence of the soul, particular understandings of human dignity, human worth, certain weightiness or lightness of relationships or commitments or things of that sort. Distinctions between this space versus that space, sacred space versus non-sacred space, churches versus shopping malls, graveyards versus outhouses, and so on. And as a result, the range of possible configurations that you can make of those drives, the range of possible ways that you can address those drives through new institutions, new arrangements, new practices, ends up being curtailed because you've already slotted these all into this one big thing that encompasses them all, and it drags every other one of them with itself, however you reconfigure the religious, because it must encompass these things. Even if it excludes one by deliberate fiat. You know, we're excluding morality from religion. We're excluding God from religion. We're excluding conceptions of the soul from religion. We have a purely social notion and so on and so forth. The fact that you have this thing taking up this intellectual geography, this space, means that you are so much less nimble in how you addressing all of those drives that are real and lumped under the category of religion. So one of the things that Brooks brings up in his video response to me is a book called The Religion of the Future. I think that's what it is, by a guy called Unger. Really interesting book, by the way. I actually agree 100% with Brooks's argument in that video, but here's the problem. Even by insisting, as Unger does, that the religion of the future will be a religion that is not religion, the problem is, even by insisting upon something unitary, the shadow of that collection remains active as a piece on the board, taking up additional space that really should be broken up and should be allowed to move independently. And so maybe the religion of the future, quote unquote, shouldn't even not be religion at all. It shouldn't just be unrecognizable. It should be multiple. The things that address these different things that are lumped under religion may be many, right? And they may not be related to each other. You may be able to resolve issues about anxiety, about death, for example, with this thing over here, and then questions about God with this thing over here, questions about social discipline, this thing over here, intelligibility, familiarity, ritual, and so on and so forth with this thing over here. They may all be independent from one another. And the problem with insisting, as Andrewism does, that as leftists, for example, or as anarchists, what have you, we should rehabilitate religion and find a way to make, rethink our relationship with religion. The problem with this is it insists upon the category of religion remaining after the fact, so that you end up still with this thing occupying all of this space. This space, by the way, which in other societies, other communities, has been actually broken up before. There's a book by, I think it's William Kavanaugh, it's been a little while, called The Myth of Religious Violence. I don't necessarily recommend it. It's an okay book. There are better sources. But one of the things that he goes into at one point is the confusion of anthropologists looking at India once upon a time, because they were looking for the equivalent of Christian churches as their model for religion in other places, in colonized lands. And they noticed that members of Hindu cults and Muslims went to the same quote-unquote like religious or temple structures for different things. It's like, that's weird. There seems to be some kind of conflation here. And that these actually served a whole bunch of, quote-unquote secular functions. And the reason why is because they didn't have this category of religion that encompassed all of these things together. In fact, most of these terms, if you were actually being really rigorous about it, they wouldn't mean the same thing. They wouldn't, strictly speaking, mean temple. We mean something specific by temple that wouldn't actually apply elsewhere. And one of the reasons why this is very confusing for people is because as a consequence of colonialism, we have this thing called international law. International law is actually a projection of specific Western conceptions of state law, I guess technically common law, but applied in codes, in written codes, to areas beyond the authority of any actual state. But here's the rub. In order to be recognized by international law, in order to, manipulate the normative principles of Western states to, for example, acknowledge your right to exist, as Indian nationalists had to do, you need to represent yourself in terms that are digestible by the collective of states, all of which are Western in structure. And so you had a situation where Indian groups, Indian religions, and so on, Indian religions, I'm even using that term now, Indian groups and so on would have to reconstitute and represent themselves in terms that made them commensurate with Western churches or national groups or so on. This is why India as a country now exists, because Indian nationalism really shouldn't be a thing, except for the fact that India as a collective was subjugated by the British. Because India is a vast and diverse place, just like China is a vast and diverse place. Many kingdoms have occupied those massive lands. They aren't one thing. There are so many different groups of people, so many different communities of belief and ritual and ethnicity and all these things in India. But states don't respect that. They respect nations. So now all of a sudden you had a situation where you have a transformation of Indian culture to conform in certain key ways to the form of Western style political groupings. And same with religion. In order to be recognized as valid, quote unquote religious communities had to represent themselves as religious communities, ergo as church-like. And you can see where I live, as a matter of fact. You can see where failing to do this actually can cost you dearly. There are burial grounds by the native tribes that used to occupy territories here that were bulldozed to make way for hotels and resorts and such. Why was this allowed to be done? Religious grounds are protected under Canadian law. Well, they didn't have any structures on top of them. No, they were caves. They were caves with human remains in them. So they didn't count. Their sacredness, their importance, if we want to speak in very general terms, to the group that inherited, these grounds as a possession, or for whom these were relevant, they didn't build a church on top of them, so they didn't appear to be religious to a state system that only registered things that occupied or that assumed a Christian form, that only treated that as having the protection of law. It's a big problem. What about the Indian caste system? That's not really what I'm talking about. Ancient religions were mostly pre-scientific, so it wasn't a problem for them. What do you think that means? What does that mean? What do you mean an ancient religion was pre-scientific? What is the distinction? When did the prophet come and announce the beginning of science? Explain this to me. Pythagoras sacrificed a goat. Explain this to me.
This video and for the succeeding videos are numerous. I now have a new shelf dedicated just to this topic. So if this is something that interests you, please check out the sources for this series. They're in the description and they'll also pop up whenever and wherever I mention them.
There is nothing in the description here, by the way. Can I refresh this? Was there a loading error? There's nothing in the description.
Science and religion are necessary.
Gutsick, you forgot to put the description in.
Necessarily enemies. The sources for this video and for the succeeding videos are numerous. I now have a new shelf dedicated
There's nothing there!
Wherever I mention them. Now, like I said, creationism comes in many flavors, but they all...
Before scientific method or something? Which scientific method? There's not just one scientific method. Guys, scientific method. There's not just one scientific method. Science uses many methods.
All share one thing in common. Their root cause for denying science to varying degrees can be found in their interpretation of the Bible. Specifically, it can be found in their plain reading of the first book, Genesis. Using this text, which they believe is divinely inspired and thus inerrant, they argue against scientific consensus on the age of the Earth and evolution, along with many other topics. But has that always been the case? Or is the definition of what is plain or literal when it comes to reading the Bible just as subject to change as the culture, critters, or crust of the earth? How has Western science and religion changed over time, and where have they clashed with other aspects of human culture, like politics? This is a long story, and I'm also long-winded, so as a marker for our series here, this video primarily concerns itself—
Francis Bacon's scientific method? That is Francis Bacon's scientific method. That is not the only scientific— Science goes way back. A good way to think of science is just ways of knowing, okay? Ways of knowing things, ways of acquiring knowledge, ways of establishing, in Laturian language, propositions to be matters of concern. There is no one scientific method. That's wrong. That is very wrong, as a matter of fact. What Francis Bacon proposes is absolutely, and what he did is absolutely valid and absolutely useful. But that does not encompass science.
with the first wave of creationism, which
Science means knowledge. That's a tautology. Yeah. Well, no, it's science. Why would that be a tautology? Like, science means knowledge, so science is ways of acquiring knowledge. What we call science is ways of acquiring knowledge. It's not a tautology. I'm not making a syllogism. I'm saying what the thing means.
I am calling the deluvialist wave. The climax of this entire story is notoriously placed in the 20th and 21st centuries with the Scopes and Dover trials, as well as the birth of modern fundamentalism, but I'm going to argue that by the dawn of the 1900s, creationism was dead, and science had killed it with the help of religion. How did that happen? And what does that make the creationism of today, or even that of the early 20th century?
That's the question.
All of that is soon to come, but our story begins much deeper in the annals of history. Our roadmap for this video is important. We need to know the history of human thought with regard to the age of the Earth and evolution, but that story actually requires us going back pretty far.
She had a rough setup. I'm actually liking where this is going now.
For any major discovery in either subject, before the invention of creation,
Still no sources, though, and that I do not forgive.
before the advent of Christianity, before the origin of civilization itself. And this is because
What? Wait.
discovery in either subject requires us going back pretty far. Before any major discovery in either subject, before the invention of creationism, before the advent of Christianity, before the origin of civilization itself.
How?
And this is because, as with all stories, the history that precedes the climax is what shaped it in the first place. In this case, it might have even made it inevitable.
I feel like my hay fever is making this very difficult. I need to hear this one more time.
As with all stories, the history that precedes the climax is what shaped it in the first place. In this case, it might have even made it inevitable.
Okay. I don't like that word.
One side effect of being an intelligent animal seems to be an understanding of death.
I wouldn't know.
First, we're born, that is to say, we start being here. We're here for a while, interacting with each other and with the world at large, and then we die. That is to say, we stop being here. Other organisms do the same thing.
It's still there, look. It's right there.
Sometimes for shorter periods of time and sometimes for longer periods of time. The impermanence of stuff, though, from animals to cities, is obvious to every human on the planet. Things start and then they stop, and they overlap in weird ways. Early human societies understood beginnings and ends, the concepts of impermanence and change. Other hominins did too, so it was only a matter of time.
Why do you think so? I just find that an odd statement. Why do you think they thought that? Why do you think we have access to what they thought or how they thought? Because we can't talk to them. We aren't able to ask. We have what? Their tools? Their relics? We don't know what went into the creation of those things. We don't know what dynamics produced those things. You can't read. You can't read human or pre-human cognition out of their tools. That's not how that works. Because she's a primatologist? Is that a... I don't know if that's humorous.
Until the first human looked down at the...
Primatologists are notorious for anthropomorphizing and actually a little bit worse for taking principles from other fields and projecting them onto pre-human psychology, often by way of primates. For example, Jane Goodall and apes going to war. War is a state of conflict between political institutions or between agents understood in a particular way that has a beginning, a state of things, and an end, both of which are institutionalized. Apes do not go to war. Apes have prolonged hostilities with each other that involve certain areas that they traverse and guard, which is not the same thing as territory, which also has a history. There's a great book by Stuart Eldon called The Birth of Territory. Very long, very dry, very good though. Primatologists will very frequently project, especially modern human principles, onto primates, onto non-humans, onto early humans, with the understanding that primates and early humans are more closely related, quote unquote. The problem here is that, intellectually speaking, just as, for example, I could not read to you the thoughts and feelings of a modern Indian person through the tools I find in their house, I can't read to you the thoughts and feelings and beliefs of a person living in a cave from the stacks of rocks and the wall paintings I find around it. That doesn't work. That is actually quite a dangerous, and I mean this in a very strong sense, that is actually a very dangerous line of thinking. Why? Well, when you project ideas into prehistory based on the reading of tools, what you actually in fact end up doing is take modern principles that we have that are intelligible to us, and you fix them beyond the realm of contingency. Even if you're taking an evolutionary lens where everything is subject to historical change and development, you are taking this thing and asserting that its being, its existence, its root is not in decisions, not in human actions, not in history, but in this process beyond history. This process that transcends culture and society and invention. Even if you insist after the fact that, of course, they invented these things, the problem is that this has still been stratified. This has still been separated from everything else, and therefore what is over here can refer to that as a separate point on the chart. Now you have 2 points of contact when you say, this is natural, this is correct, this is intuitive, this is permanent, being the major issue. This is a permanent concern for humans. That's a really big problem, because what is a permanent concern for humans or for organisms is something that must be addressed and must be taken into account regardless of our conception of everything else. Which is one of the reasons why Thomas Hobbes, in arguing against the validity, the validity or the viability of any revolutionary action, any sort of social reform that potentially upsets the present order, referred the justification for oppressive institutions to a state of nature, because this is how we are prior to the state. So the state, insofar as it satisfies those permanent needs, is justified. Extraordinarily dangerous line of thinking. Again, I like Gutsick Gibbon. This is not a critique of her. I see this ubiquitously with primatologists. I see this with people in STEM who dip into anthropology all the time. My favorite YouTuber, Angela Collier, does it. I've got a video coming out about that soon, which will be on Patreon in a couple weeks. It's really bad. It's really bad.
Ground or up at the sky and thought, how long has that been here? And from the very first people capable of leaving records behind, there were those who answered that question with a very, very long time. For some, the answer was that the Earth had always been. Much of our understanding as to how ancient people conceived of the world and of its age comes from their creation stories, from their cosmology.
Is that a toga?
from their king's lists. By looking at stories and relics left behind through space and through time, we can understand that ancient people thought the Earth came about from a myriad of different ways, depending on who you talk to and when you ask
We're getting GTA 6 for the Collier video. Now you're getting the Collier video in the next 2 weeks.
the question.
That's the only project I'm working on until it's done.
Sometimes the Earth is born from a previous world thanks to a mother deity. Sometimes the
That bear is not safe for YouTube.
Earth is born from a previous world thanks to a mother deity. Sometimes it is brought forth from chaos by a god or goddess's words, music, or secretion.
That looked like a... Was that supposed to be a xenomorph?
Forth from chaos by a god or goddess.
Is that supposed to be a xenomorph? I like that.
Words, music, or secretions. It can be assembled by an earth diver or sent by a god to grow from another god's dismembered body. Sometimes a giant egg hatches. One
We're getting GTA 6 before Bloodborne Part 2. No, that's the second video I'm working on after the Collier one.
Egyptian creation myth has the...
And then I'm finishing the Order of Things video, and then I'm finishing the Rachel Wilson response video. That'll probably be a little bit of a shorter project because it's a really dumb book.
world emerging from the distant past out of a dead sea that stretches infinitely in all directions at a moment called Zep Tepi, or the first occasion. For me personally, I do like that better than the world having emerged from someone's spit or seminal fluid. The timing of things in many
Why? What's your issue with those things?
of these stories is pretty ambiguous.
I mean, I emerged from those things.
There is a before
Probably not spit.
time, that is
Although you never know.
to say before the earth was formed, and then the earth is formed, and history begins. Context in many of these stories suggests that the before time was not brief. Countless world iterations sprawl into the past, or chaos reigns, or the gods confer, or the egg incubates. And this holds for the Hebrew creation story too, actually. For instance, how long does the Spirit of God hover over the primordial waters?
Actually, the Hebrew story is actually very interesting for a number of reasons. The main one is that where most other contemporaneous belief systems to that, contemporaneous texts, I should say. I don't like to infer belief systems. Contemporaneous texts, roughly contemporaneous. Enuma Elish, for example. Theogony, if you will. The theogonies later. They, much later, they personify the earth, the waters, the darkness, chaos, the fish, the animals. Not Genesis. Genesis separates all of these things from the persona, which is plural, by the way. Elohim is plural. It's actually taken from I can't remember off the top of my head what it's actually taken from, but it was a term that was used outside of the Hebrews, and it was in the plural form, in a first person plural, but in the plural form, I think. And all of these things were treated as dumb, non-personal, non-conscious, non-thinking, non-acting. The earth is without form and it doesn't do shit. The void is without form. It doesn't do shit. There's darkness. It doesn't do shit. It's just there. It's all just passively there. God just makes them. And in a certain sense, it's actually prefiguring in a certain way. Richard Dawkins, famous friend of Richard Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein, not Richard Epstein. That should be Dawkins' new name. Who said that, well, some of us just go one God further. It's like, yeah, it's actually very interesting that the opening line of Genesis can be read as a profound statement of atheism. Boom, 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 boom. Look at all of these things that are the centerpiece of all of these societies, all these communities. That's just stuff. It's just a thing that was there. It's just a thing that was there, and so on.
How long were the primordial waters there? The point, of course, wasn't to put a number to things. It was to contextualize humans' existence. Humans didn't exist, and then they did. It's interesting how unimportant putting an actual number was to things for...
I'm going to be real with you. I actually think this is an incorrect framing. I think Bergson had a very good point when he argued that the notion of nothing is actually more conceptually complex than the notion of something. Why? Well, and this has been brought up in creationist spheres a lot, because they argue with people like, for example, Lawrence Krauss, who wrote a book called Something from Nothing, or A Universe from Nothing, rather. That out of nothing, nothing comes, okay? Like, you can't say there isn't a God or whatever, because then you have no explanation for how stuff got here. Nothing is more primary. You need an explanation for adding stuff to nothing for there to be a universe. But then Bergson runs through the process of imagining nothing in our discourse. And what do? Well, nothing as a concept, it's not absurd, but it's not simple. When I think of non-being, I think of the object, and then I imagine its absence. Non-being is always the non-being of something we've already pictured. So in order to even arrive at a notion of nothing, we have to have conceived of the whole first, and then have removed it in imagination. And then insist upon that state of removal as something prior. And the reason why I bring this up is not to make a strong statement about whether or not there is some kind of primordial permanent being that doesn't need to be accounted for, or that something is prior to nothing metaphysically, because I just plumb don't know. But I have serious doubts that someone in antiquity would have that conception of the world as primarily nothing, such that the primordial waters would stand in need of an explanation. They wouldn't even call it primordial, just the waters would just be the substrate of stuff. It's the natural form of stuff. The unmodified form of everything that's always here. And there wouldn't be an assertion of, it goes back a very long time. No, what goes back a long time are the events that transpired since that stuff was turned into something that we recognize. But you wouldn't have a sense of time outside of that. You wouldn't think about it that way. Right? It would just be, you would think about it in flat terms, chronologically. There's just, underlying everything is this basic stuff. This basic formless stuff that has to be given form. Heidegger was apparently very right in understanding Greek gods representing the laws of nature and are understood as those things themselves, unfortunately. I don't think the Greeks would understand the notion of a law of nature. They would understand law as being intrinsically opposed to nature, actually. So I think that would be incorrect, not being a Heidegger reader yet. But actually, it's not sure I am a Heidegger reader, but no, I haven't read enough Heidegger.
These ancient people, but they had bigger issues at hand. They needed to secure consistent water and food and safety before they could even begin to start putting the big questions to papyrus.
Ooh, I don't like that. So this is another anthropological myth. And it's the myth of subsistence, and it's the idea that, before societies got rich to a certain point, they didn't engage in any kind of leisurely activities or any kind of thought or creativity. This is incorrect. In fact, they engaged in a lot of these things. It's one of the reasons why they had encyclopedic knowledge of plants and animals that they didn't actually have a use for. It's one of the reasons why they developed stories and why they developed games and costumes and tools that didn't have to do with raw survival. It's why they left carvings behind. Why they left paintings behind. They had time. And they had a surplus of food. They had times of scarcity, and sometimes these wiped them out. But it is a myth that it is a condition of humans thinking creatively and philosophically that they must therefore have an abundance of surplus supplies. That is not true. That is very far from being true. Again, one of my issues with primatologists and people in STEM attempting to do anthropology is that they take anthropology for granted. They take primatology as being essentially pure, not inflected by political or anthropological or social prejudices, myths, presuppositions, etc., and they just go straight to trying to explain man by way of monkey. And it doesn't work. Does not work. I know they're not monkeys. I know they're just being cute.
Some civilizations did take a stab at placing a numeric age to the Earth. These estimates can be gleaned from some civilizations' kings lists. For example, the Sumerian kings list includes antediluvian reigns stretching well over 200,000.
This is weird because she has repeatedly argued about the complexity of culture and thought in prehistoric humans. Yeah, it could be, but here's the thing though, if you haven't thought through this very carefully, it's very easy to hold contradictory information simultaneously in your head. Right? So, it is perfectly normal for someone to be able to say on one video, oh yeah, these ancient cultures, they're much more complex than we give them credit for. And also in the other, yeah, they needed, nobody had philosophy or thinking or whatever until they got rich to some degree. Till they overcame the initial conditions of scarcity. Forgetting that even non-primate animals play.
Years into the past. There is no reason to suggest that Sumer itself existed for 200,000 years. However, the Sumerian conception of their own history may have been very ancient. Some scholars have suggested mathematical conventions or narrative reasons for
This dude's eyes crack me up.
such a deep history as well, but this is one of the first examples of a long numeric time frame given to at least human history by a people group. Still, this king's list is
Gods are human archetypes to the Greeks. You have no power here, Carl Jung.
permeated by the influence of the gods. It isn't an attempt at geology, but a light theogony with human cameos. The Greeks, who hadn't invented glasses, but whose texts and histories would go on to influence many early Christian thinkers, would produce some of the first written records musing about the age of the earth, and from a naturalistic perspective. They were one of the first civilizations where writing and free time converged and allowed people to sit around and consider, ponder, and mull over everything from philosophy to the natural world.
You do not require writing or the preponderance of writing and writing implements in order to ponder the world. I also don't like that we're using the word natural here. The natural world as opposed to what? Aristotle considered political society to be an extension of the world. We were political by nature, explicitly. Gutsick, you're making me gutsick.
One of the first of these was Xenophanes, a Greek poet from the 5th and 6th century BC. Xenophanes,
At least you didn't say Xenophanes.
perhaps controversially, believed that the gods were relatively uninvolved in the affairs of humans, leading him to propose a naturalistic explanation for natural phenomena, from St. Elmo's fire to fossils. He proposed that fossils of marine animals on land meant that land was once covered by water. Marine transgressions explained shells, fish bones, and seal prints being found in quarries and mountains. The sea and land being able to switch places. This, as you can imagine, was a pretty groundbreaking idea. Still, it was well reasoned and accepted to the degree that Herodotus, considered the father of history by many, would propose in the 5th century BC that
I don't even care if somebody finds out, well, technically, actually, this Greek scholar is determined to probably be Herodotus. It's Herodotus. Stop it, nerds.
the Nile River had once been a gulf, and that perhaps the change from gulf to the river that people now saw today had taken as long as 20,000 years. Xanthus of Sardis would propose that the marine fossils found on the plains were formed in roughly the same way. Then Aristotle would take things to the next level in his piece Meteorologica, which is arguably the first dedicated text on geology in history. In it, he mused on the nature of volcanoes, earthquakes, and marine transgressions alike. Aristotle
I hate that summary.
Was different though because he put a timeline to things. Rivers and seas could form and dissipate in perpetuity because the earth was eternal. That's plenty of time for the earth and geology generally to mix things up, right? Forever. Now, critically, Aristotle reached this conclusion from a naturalistic perspective. He looked around him and saw every kind of geologic formation in various states of growth or collapse.
All right, and here's the problem, though. Here's the problem, though. That's not naturalistic. Aristotle did not have the capacity to think in naturalistic terms because he didn't have a doubling of the world that a naturalism presupposes, a naturalistic position presupposes as that which it is rejecting. Naturalism is the insistence that we understand the world on its terms and not by reference to some additional realm of being. If you don't propose that additional realm of being, and that hasn't been proposed yet, there is no basis for asserting naturalism because that's the only game in town. That's the intuitive default stance. This is why, for example, in Homer, they physically, while alive, can walk to the underworld because it's not actually a different plane of existence. Now, here's where it gets weird. When we're talking about growth and decay, Aristotle had this conception that there was in fact a form to every type of organization of stuff. He called this hylomorphism. The idea is that things that maintain a form over time, living organisms, for example, that grow and decay and so on and so forth, are a mixture of matter and form, matter and idea, right? The idea in here is in the matter. There is some principle inside of the thing that is the first and last cause of its growth and decay. First and final cause of growth and decay. And this is just one term, by the way, of the four causes. By the way, when people say Aristotle's causes, an easier way to understand it is Aristotle's modes of explanation. These are the ways in which a thing can be explained. By reference, for example, to its internal life cycle, the situation of the process of growth and decay that is proper to it. Or by reference to the immediate thing that triggered this thing's emergence in our sight. So on and so forth, stuff like that. This, however, still doesn't permit naturalism. Why? Because the form, the notion of form, is what gives rise not to the existence of objects, but to the formation of matter into different shapes, into different dynamics, and so on and so forth. You can't be a naturalist in Aristotle's time. It's not on the table. That's not an option. It's actually not a thinkable proposition at this stage. You need something that divides the world into two, so that you have a higher order of things and a lower order of things, such that the higher order of things can be rejected. One of the frustrating things about this essay is that it is projecting a lot of presentist modern stuff into a very not modern setting.
From oceans and mountains to floodplains and foothills. And this was a pretty popular way of thinking, in part because it was Aristotle who was the one proposing it, but also because there was just no way to put a finite number to anything. People tried, of course, but it was always kind of a...
Aristotle thought there was a finite number of forms in the world. There were literally a finite number of organisms. A fixed number of organisms. Nature is economical in our sense and doesn't make redundant things. That's wrong. You couldn't be a scientist in Aristotle's time? Absolutely you could be. You couldn't be a scientist by vocation as we understand the term, because we employ scientists who are trained at university to do a job. but science absolutely existed in Aristotle's time. Aristotle did do science.
A ballpark thing. And this was due in part to the fact that no one was writing this type of thing down. Thinking was still in its early stages with regard to being put to paper.
What? No, it wasn't. Hang on, what?
This was due in part to the fact that no one was writing this type of thing down. Thinking was still in its early stages with regard to being put to paper.
I mean, to paper, sure, because paper wasn't very common, but here's the problem. There were libraries back then. You mentioned Herodotus earlier. Do you know how Herodotus wrote his histories? Which actually translates to inquiries. Historia, inquiry. He went to different places, and he asked for their books. Can I see your records? Can you read to me from your records? That's where he got his information from. Wrote a big, thick honkin' thing, too, as a result. Now, it is true, we didn't have the same quantity of writing that we do now, absolutely, and certainly not the same access to it, but thinking absolutely took place. Writing was absolutely, massively advanced in terms of business, exchange, and so on. The Athenians, by this time, had dedicated navies. You know what dedicated navies require? Triremes. The ships they used were called triremes. Triremes had no economic value. This is very important because a ship with no economic value is a ship whose maintenance is not self-assured. See, a hoplite, standard Athenian soldier, was a normal citizen who in time of war was supposed to supply his own weaponry and armor and join a squad and go fight as part of a block with a spear and a shield and a helmet and all that other stuff that he brought himself. Maybe passed down from father to son. So when the war's over, he goes back to work. He goes back to his farm. He goes back to doing whatever he's doing, and he maintains himself. He has kids, and there's a new soldier next time there's a war. Or there's the same soldier next time there's a war. Triremes are not like this, because in between conflicts, they have no use. And they require trained, experienced pilots to man. You need rowers who are in sync and who are strong. You need pilots who know how to steer them. You need tactics. You need training. So, you need to take into account a whole lot of people that you need to coordinate and fund to do non-economically viable activity. You need to fund their training and drilling and practice and patrolling and all this stuff. For that, you need writing. You need writing. You need math. For the construction of the triremes, you need writing. These people were very sophisticated, technically and intellectually. These people were not stupid. The state of literary culture was actually very sophisticated. By Aristotle's time, you had poems and plays and all this stuff that are still read and mined for value today. Sophocles was not an unsophisticated, unphilosophical person. And he was less philosophical than a lot of them, by the way. He's kind of on the conservative end of things. Not as bad as Euripides.
So the eternal nature
I find Euripides boring, but that's just me.
of the earth and the universe took hold with the Greeks and would hold through the Romans and the early Christian thinkers and through the death of Jesus. Now we got to keep an eye on those.
Slow down, cowboy. What was that? That went too fast.
Writing this type of ballpark to anything. People tried, of course, but it was always kind of a ballpark thing. And this was due in part to the fact that no one was writing this type of thing down. thinking was still in its early stages with regard to being put to paper. So the eternal nature of the earth and the universe took hold with the Greeks and would hold through the Romans and the early Christian thinkers and through the death of Jesus. Now we got to keep in
That is a very strange thing to say. By the time of the death of Jesus, the curvature of the earth had been known for I think 300 years about. Little under that. Hundreds of years they'd known this. No, that's wrong. And amidst all of this, you had atomists, you had people with different elemental theories, you had all this stuff. They were very sophisticated, and they were very complex, and they were very diverse, and there were indeed theories about the world not being eternal. There were theories about the world not being eternal in America. This is very wrong. This is very wrong. Imagine. I'm sorry. What was his name? He was played by Anthony Hopkins in the Alexander movie. Only good thing about it was oh shit, what's his name? Begins with a P, I think. It's on the tip of my tongue. Help me out here. Who was that? He was in Alexandria. Ptolemy. That's it. Ptolemy. Oh. The Library of Alexandria is 3rd century BCE. Just. No. This is pain. This is pain.
Keep an eye on those Christians, because they're about to take the baton from the Greeks and Romans and start to shape Western thinking themselves.
Oh no. Oh no.
Many of these early Christians,
They're shaping Western. They're taking it from the Greeks and Romans and they are the Greeks and Romans. They are the Greeks and Romans. Also, what's the West? What do you mean the West? What do you mean Western thinking? What do you mean? Oh no, wait a minute. I'm gonna check the transcript quickly. I need to check something. Oh, please don't be like that. Please don't be like that. Uh-oh. Oh no. Oh no. We have 3 references to Islam here.
everything astronomically revolved around the Earth. This idea
4-hour video.
It was linked to the sentiment held by the church at the time that the Earth was the center of creation and humans effectively the pinnacle. Science advances when people have the luxury of time. As the Renaissance began to intensify in the 16th century, much as we saw with the Hellenistic period and with the Islamic Golden Age, people finally had a moment to sit back and ask some questions. As previously mentioned, the idea that the Earth might circle the sun first showed up with the Greeks, but that position was either lost or so unbelievably unpopular in medieval Italy that geocentrism reigned supreme, with no small help from the Catholic Church. Renaissance
Okay. I can't. I can't even. This is really bad. This is a really bad video, actually. Here's how I would actually go about this. Here's how I would talk about the issue of creationism. And I think I'll sign off with this because we're going for a little while. And there's a video by Richard the Goat, which is premiering after this. I'm gonna read into. But here's the thing. Science and religion operate as concepts that create fictional externalities to the pliant part of the human collective. And what I mean is, when we refer to science with a capital S, or religion as just this domain of human life that is just there, we just take it for granted, there's a bunch of things that are lumped into this category of religion, then we are faced with a notion of human community that presumes that these two separate spheres are always there. They're the furniture of our world.
At Thumbdump and the Bump Chump super chatted $5. She even mentions the Islamic Golden Age. A lot of this I can forgive, but she should have known better.
It's just like, man. It's just like, come on. Come on. Dark Ages, Islamic, whatever. Anyways, here's the thing. Look. When you accept those externalities, you end up relying on those externalities. You refer to them. You talk about, well, what do we need to do as a collective to live in the world? Well, we need to address these fixed parts of the world, obviously. This is the motivation both for creationists wanting creationism taught in school to teach the controversy, so to speak, and why people want creationism to not be taught in school. Why? Because there is this domain of religion that is asserting its rights as an eternal part of the human condition, and there is this domain of science that is insisting on the fixity of nature as something that always imposes a demand on us to take it seriously and address it. That is seen to be flouted by people, presenting fictional accounts of the origin of the Earth and fictional characters accounting for that origin to children. The issue here is that the only way you resolve this, when you treat these things as externalities, is through an act of tyranny. You have to tell someone, hey, you are in the domain of the irrational. You are operating in an invalid space. Your opinions, your voices cannot therefore matter, and we cast you out. You are in the position of the atheistic and the immoral. We cast you out. We despise what you represent for us morally and culturally, etc., etc. Be gone. And the result of this is that these groups are not eliminated from the discussion. They are simply moved out of the realm of the discussion. They're no longer part of the collective. And so they stew underneath whichever one it is that is cast out. Once upon a time, it was atheists and scientists and so on. And these days, it's often creationists. And they don't come back with new appeals to the collective, saying like, hey, look, we've got some new material to, make it convince you that our concerns are important and should be taken account of. Instead, they find ways to usurp the authority of those parts of that collective that pushed them out to begin with. And so you have creationists attempting to get in politicians to brute force creationism into schools. Brute force out, for example, different approaches to sex and gender in public education or in literature that create sort of a normative, pressure against their positions in other spaces. They try to assert spatial and political dominance through violence as opposed to through negotiation. What we need to do is, and I agree with Latour 100% on this, we need to reject this idea that there is an externality that we can refer to that is not conditioned by our discourse and by our politics. Nature, psychology, religion, all of these externalities that assert themselves as being fixed and immutable principles, gods in our pantheon, if you will, they gotta go, because every single one of these short circuits the actual process of human self-understanding, of collective human self-understanding. It's a problem. Referring to scarcity, for example, as Gutsick did here, as the thing that must be overcome as a condition of thought, plays the same role. Now all of a sudden, for example, people in certain technological conditions say, well, they can be treated as fundamentally invalid, almost unhuman, because they have not attained to the conditions of what we value about our intellectual life. For instance, projecting war into nature in the same way as Jane Goodall did, projecting war into primates makes war now a permanent fixture of human existence. Despite the kindness of her general project, this leads fundamentally to a Hobbesian approach to humanity. So, no more of that. Bad Gutsick. You're supposed to be the better Gibbon. We already have a bad Gibbon. He wrote too much. Alright, I'm sending you to Richard the Goat's channel because I gotta go get to work on my Angela Collier video. Thanks everybody for joining me. Join my Patreon if you want to help support my streams. I rely on your support to keep things running and to spend all of my time reading so I can write cool stuff and talk about this stuff at a certain high level. And it's exhausting, it's a lot of work, but I love it, but it does need money. So if you want to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon. There are exclusive streams there. There is also early access to new work, as well as early versions of work that you can then judge and contribute to, and so on and so forth. Please also, when I raid into Richard the Goat, please also subscribe to his channel. It is fantastic. And he is also helping to run the GSL, which is our new theory community channel for people in this space, between this space and the QC. All right, have a good night, everyone. Take it easy, and I will see you tomorrow at 1:30 p.m. PDT. Ciao.